What is your main argument to them about why they should be investing in the United States right now, Mr. Secretary?
It's the same reason as American companies should be, and in fact are, namely regulatory reform, getting rid of red tape, tax reform, getting our rates down to very, very competitive levels, unleashing our energy resources, fixing our trade agreements, and creating a much more healthy environment for businesses and consumers. So all of those reasons are the why.
Excuse me. So let's talk about fixing those trade agreements. One of the things you mentioned, which comes within your purview. To what extent is fixing the trade agreements? You've been very outspoken. You want trade, but you want fair trade. To what extent do tightening up those trade arrangements encourage U.S. investment in the sense that people need to be here to manufacture so they're not subject to whatever restrictions there might be?
Well, I think it's a factor, but probably a relatively small factor. I think cutting the tax rates hugely, as we have is planned to do, is a very, very big benefit. Our tax structure used to be a major disadvantage. Similarly, our regulatory structure had been a huge disadvantage. We were, I believe, the most over-regulated country going. Well, when you're paying a lot of tax and you're having a lot of regulatory red tape, that discourages not only greenfield investment, it discourages any kind of investment in the country. So we think it's mostly a question of removing impediments and then coupling that with the normal benefits of the U.S., a huge population base, wonderful market, open access to it once you're here, highly educated workforce. Those are the kinds of fundamental factors that were always at work, but now are supplemented with the improvements in business climate created by President Trump.
As you suggest, Mr. Secretary, you have plans to cut taxes as well as reform taxes, two somewhat different things. You have plans, and there's a lot of euphoria about that initially during the Trump administration. What do you say to would-be investors right now who say, let's wait and see if that happens, because right now it looks somewhat less likely or is certainly delayed from what we originally thought last January?
Well, the timing the administration has very little control over. That really requires activity by the Congress. But we seem to be making very good progress on health care reform, and that's really the prerequisite to getting the tax reform enacted. So the first key to timing on tax will be when we get the health care reform completed.
Talk about the trade agreements again that you raised. Where are we right now? For example, let's be specific on NAFTA. We've talked about that before when you've been on the program. Where are we in the process of renegotiating NAFTA, and who's responsible? Is it you or is it your colleague Bob Lighthizer?
Well, as to where we are right now awaiting the maturation of the 90-day letter that we're required under the Trade Promotion Act to send to the Congress. That clock ticks on the 18th of August. 30 days before that, we will be revealing to the Congress a more detailed negotiating strategy than we had discussed with them before. So the 18th of August is a big red letter day for trade. But even short of that, we have a big day. Very soon, in the middle of July, is our next announcement period and next meeting session with the Chinese. As you know, we've accomplished quite a little bit ever since the détente at the Mar-a-Lago conference, and we're hoping to achieve still more deliverable items in the very, very near future.
Okay, we want to welcome again our listeners on Bloomberg Radio as well as Bloomberg TV. We're talking with Wilbur Ross, the U.S. Commerce Secretary. So before we get to China, let's go back just for a moment to NAFTA. So you're saying mid-July, there's supposed to be a more detailed outline of the negotiating strategy to commerce. Then August 18, you really start the negotiations. Give us a sense after that, what is your hope on the timetable when you might have something concluded with the Mexican government and the Canadian?
Well, both governments are quite receptive to the idea of a renegotiation. They both know that this is, at best, an outdated agreement. doesn't really address the digital economy. It doesn't very much address services in general. Certainly doesn't do much on financial services. Also doesn't do very much on natural resources. So those are some big gaping holes in it, in part because the Mexicans have changed their regulations for the better on natural resources, and in part because nobody way back when NAFTA was negotiated even knew there would be the digital economy. So first of all, it needs updating. Second of all, it needs some reprovisioning to adjust to the economic realities of today. For example, there are rules of origin, namely what percentage of the total content of a product will qualify as true NAFTA product, even though it came from outside NAFTA. In automotive, they specified particular parts to which the percentage is applied. Well, half those parts aren't even used in cars anymore because automotive technology has progressed. So there are many things like that that need to be fixed. And I think everybody is up to the idea of fixing them.
Is currency manipulation on the agenda in the negotiations with Canada and Mexico?
Well, neither Canada nor Mexico, in my view, is a currency manipulator. As you're aware, the Congress has specified that determining whether currency is manipulated is the purview of Treasury, and Congress has laid out very, very specific tests to apply. Those tests are applied twice a year, generally in April and October, and very recently Treasury Secretary Mnuchin released the results of this year and found that there are no currency manipulations. That's quite different from the question, are there misalignments? I think the Mexican peso, for example, has been very weak against the dollar, partly out of concern that the trade negotiations might go very badly. It lately has rallied some, and my best guess is that once we have a new NAFTA, there's a pretty good chance that both the Canadian and the Mexican currencies will strengthen because of removing that uncertainty from their picture. So that's the way we're looking at currency vis-a-vis these negotiations.
We're speaking with Wilbur Ross. He's U.S. Commerce Secretary for Television and Radio on Bloomberg. So, Mr. Secretary, let's talk about one specific product, and that is steel. The administration has been quite outspoken and, I must say, has taken some action on steel that hasn't been taken in a good long time. There are various reports about what the approach to steel might be, including the idea that perhaps there would be duty-free going up to a quota, and then after that a duty would kick in. Can you tell us what the approach of the Trump administration is right now to steel imports?
Well, it's right now a work in progress because we have not yet submitted our report from Commerce to the President, nor has he had a chance, therefore, to act upon it. But in general, enforcement has been a very big hallmark of the present administration. We now have in place 161 trade cases which have put either anti-dumping or countervailing duties on steel products from about 37 different countries. So this has been a very big problem, the problem of global overcapacity and, more importantly, global overproduction. So the report will address those issues, will address them in the context of national security to find the way that Section 232 defines it, which is a pretty broad definition, including very strong reference to the needs of the economy. So it will then perhaps make some specific recommendations as to measures to deal with that, and those could range from the ones you described to more complicated ones. But the real key will be, what does the President ultimately decide to do with the recommendations? Well, he has announced that he intends to take bold action.
Mr. Secretary, what I just find puzzling is that U.S. steel producers are having trouble making money now, even though you have severe anti-dumping tariffs of like triple digits currently. why not just let it go? I mean, why you have to simulate end user demand, whether or not you do anything about China, which is having its own problems with overcapacity and their own profits. So how does any more tariffs fix that?
Well, it's more complicated than just tariffs. Under 232, there's also the potential for quotas. There's the potential for tariff rate quotas. There are all kinds of potentials to be brought to bear. The reason that the individual cases have been ineffective is that the WTO, the World Trade Organization rules, are so precise that you have to identify very clearly the product and very clearly the place of origin. And what that means is, if I'm a serial dumper, of which there are quite a few lurking out there, if I'm a serial dumper, all I have to do is transship it through another country and I evade the duty, or send it to another country for further processing, however trivial that processing might be, or give it a little further processing in my own country. So those trade cases help, but they have not been able to cure the systemic problem. That's why there are 37 different countries involved. The dumping of steel from one country into another makes that second country have excess capacity, which they then dump, and then the country they dump it into continues the saga. So 1 ton of dumped steel probably results in 3 or 4 tons of dislocation in different markets throughout the world. The 232 gives the potential for a broader solution that is less geography dependent and less individual product dependent.
Finally, Mr. Secretary, if we just read the newspapers or watch the evening news and like that, we would conclude that all of Washington is consumed with investigations of various sorts and lawyers going back and forth. Give us a peek inside the administration. You've been called perhaps the most powerful Commerce Secretary in history. You have a lot on your agenda, even as we've discussed, we've touched some of right now. To what extent does this really impinge on your ability to get your job done? Or a different way to put it, how do you avoid it becoming a distraction?
Well, it's not a distraction at all. I was in Miami on Friday with the president when he made his amazing announcement about how we're going to redo relationships with Cuba. And it was more excitement than at most average campaign rallies. It was a very heartwarming event, and especially because they had on stage a man who, when he was 12 years old, his father was assassinated by the Castro regime. And shortly after that, the regime figured out this little boy was a child prodigy violinist, so they ordered him to appear on some TV spectacular. The brave little boy refused. So the next day, the stormtroopers came to his house, surrounded him, and said, "You little boy, now you must play for us." And you know what this boy did? He played the Star-Spangled Banner. And that's what the president had him play again on the stage in Miami. It's one of the most heartwarming, heart-rending tales I've seen in a long time. The president is going about his job, which is managing the country. These investigations are something of a sideshow. As far as I can see, there's no there. It's just kind of a series of TV appearances by the various investigators, but there's been nothing tangible come to bear. And so in terms of the overall picture, the president is carrying out his program, and at Commerce, we certainly are carrying out our program.